problem or looking at it in different ways can help us find better solutions. Welcome to this episode of ReFrame, a monthly live series for women by the women of Carson that thinks about how we can reframe our thinking and approach to different problems facing women in our industry. I'm this month's host, Ana Trujillo Limon, and today I'm super excited to dive into the Queen Bee Syndrome with Dr. Patricia Villarreal, Chief Clinical Officer at Expressive Wealth. Patty, welcome to ReFrame, and thanks so much for making time for me.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be talking about this and doing that with you.
Yes, it's going to be a wonderful conversation. I could feel it just from our energy in the pre-show. We were having some good chat, so this is going to be a good, juicy one. So before we get into all of that juiciness, let's talk about your journey to becoming a clinical psychologist in the first place. What got you interested? Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, it certainly was not a linear one. I knew from a very young age, without like the deeper understanding of what it meant, that I wanted to be a psychologist. And I think as I really embarked on my higher education, I ran into some stumbling blocks externally, but also internally, with some imposter syndrome that was unfortunately fed by some systemic stuff that I think is a very real experience for like a first gen student. I took a break at different times, and then after my undergrad, kind of started working in some case management stuff. Then I was like, no, I want to be like the doer, not the referral kind of source. And so I started then with my master's, because I was like, I can't possibly actually be a doctor. And then thanks to my family's support, my husband's support, and a lot of amazing, I'll call them professional family, but mentors that helped me see me better and really take that chance on myself. I took that leap, and I'm so grateful. It's the more I do my work, the more convicted I feel in it, and the power of it. So I'm super grateful to have a chance to talk about it as a general kind of whole, but also just anytime I get to sit across from someone that is trusting me with so much of themselves, it's just like I'm in awe of that every day.
Yeah, no, I love to hear that journey. And it's like that imposter syndrome, right? You've talked about this before on stage, and I've heard you speak about this topic. It's very prevalent, especially in our communities as Latinas, as women of color, as Black women, all of the different marginalized communities face this at a higher rate. And I think that's something also I think is a barrier that maybe our research didn't uncover it, but definitely to talk about as we move forward. So you're the Chief Clinical Officer at Expressive Wealth, and that is a really cool thing. Like a lot of firms do not have this type of role. Let's talk a little bit about the role. What does it entail? How did you come to be here, and how do you work with clients?
Yeah, so it is a very cool role. I never considered that being part of my journey. It just kind of came to be after like sitting consulting with my sister, who is the CEO of Expressive Wealth. There were so many times where she'd be like, help me with this and have this conversation. Obviously without oversharing any of the details, but just like general like obstacles or like roadblocks that certain clients were having, or even just like within her team. And so, as we co-launched Empowered Network, where we were really, it was a time for really assessing the needs specifically of women in the professional world, but then also just in general as it applied to understanding the areas that maybe we take for granted in knowing, because when you're in industry, I feel like you kind of lose sight of the things that like that isn't maybe as common knowledge, and just anyway, reflecting on those things, we just decided to roll that into Expressive Wealth in a way that we feel like it should be accessible. These are really money in and of itself, but even when you're talking about estate and legacy planning, it brings up so many emotional and psychological things for families, and it's different for everyone. But whether you have a lot or a little, or wherever you qualify yourself, it is such a loaded topic. And so on the internal side, I work with the advisors, well, the whole team, and just really being able to kind of like roll in their financial knowledge and expertise along with like a more holistic understanding of like families and the human condition and all of what can be loaded in like money and that legacy piece, all of those things. And so being able to help broaden their understanding of like when we're sitting across from someone, we're not sitting across from that one person, we're sitting across from generations of obviously good but also bad. And so how does that show up not only in the present but as they plan for their future? And then with clients, it's about being a resource for them as they're kind of coming across obstacles or stuck points in any of their planning or anxieties around investing in money. It's an industry fraught with anxiety, I think, because there's no certainty. I mean, I suppose that's all of life, but so being able to support people in understanding themselves better in the context of money and supporting that process, again, on an individual basis, but also as a family structure. And so it's much more of a consulting role for sure, rather than like my role as a psychologist in my practice. But it's been super enriching just learning about all these things and having access to that stuff.
And it's so critical. I've written a lot about financial therapy, behavioral finance, all of these different things. And it's like, I feel like for a while there, the narrative in all of the articles was skewing towards, oh, well, advisors have to be everything and you have to know these, psychological principles and you have to, but it's so neat that you're there in the office and like, working with the team. And I love that because it also brings down that barrier of, my client might need some help. They are facing a barrier and they need some psychological intervention somehow, but that's a tough conversation to have. Like, hey, you go to a therapist or something. That's a hard situation to talk to a client about that. So that you're there bringing down that barrier is a beautiful thing. All of that is great. You and Vanessa, as you know, I love Vanessa, designed something super cool there. So I love that.
Yes.
But as we kind of shift to talk a little bit about the topic of the hour, we were kind of riffing on this before we hopped on the call about our state of women in wealth management research, which uncovered, well, it's not a new concept, this queen bee phenomenon. I finally found the other word. It's referred to as the queen bee phenomenon or the queen bee syndrome, but it's really like internalized sexism that kind of leads women to discriminate against other women. It's really, a survival mechanism, as we were talking about. So let's talk a little bit about your thoughts on the queen bee syndrome more broadly and how you've seen it manifest in your life and career.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think it's incredibly complex. I don't think we can look at it as just like a one-off thing to name. As you're stating, and we were chatting earlier, like I think it's layered, right? We're talking about whatever person may be engaging in some of these behaviors that are a bit more exclusive that lead to maybe this queen bee phenomenon. There's some internalized discrimination and sexism going on there. And then I do think on the receiving end, there's some of that could be going on as well in regards to how we perceive someone that is in leadership that perhaps we anticipate should be this way, but is maybe more that way. And then even just kind of how that plays into our own struggles and growth. So I think there's some parallels going on either end of that experience that I think is important to really explore and kind of build insight and unpack as individuals.
Mhm.
And additionally, I think it's the pressures, like the outside pressures, right? Like in our psych world, it's we really emphasize the importance of considering that, like, the sociopolitical impact and how, or like the current state of it and how that impacts how we respond to it. And so on a smaller ecosystem, these companies that, these financial companies where these women are maybe experiencing, or at least where the research was specifically focused on, we need to take a deeper look into that and how the culture may be creating these pressures, um, that could be leading to this behavior in across the board in leadership. As we look at it in regards to women towards women, what we don't know is what pressure is that queen bee really feeling. And additionally, I think that, in when we're talking about like an underrepresented population, the pressure in general that we feel to, like, keep, I don't know, keep moving the needle, but we don't know what that person's going through in all of their life beyond the professional world. And so it's kind of hard to feel that pressure. Not everybody wants to be a mentor, not everybody wants to be a sponsor, right? And so I think it's about having a deeper understanding of that, um, and not just working on the assumption that, oh, there's a woman, so I feel represented, and I'm going to assume that that person should be wanting to kind of pull me up as well. And if they're not, how is that being attributed to something negative potentially? So it's taking all of those things into consideration. Also, just systemically speaking, like, is there even room for that? Or is it like I am doing everything I can to keep myself afloat within this, and keep kind of growing or moving myself, and I don't have that bandwidth to really, support someone else, or maybe it's just not welcome. There's just so many layers, right?
Yeah, no, oh my gosh, you brought up so many good things there to unpack. But what I want to kind of dive into is that notion of the culture, right? The culture of the firm. So that's the first place I'll go from there. But like, I think I'm reading this book by Simon Sinek called Leaders Eat Last, and it's such a good book, and I'm halfway through. But he's talking about these experiments that were conducted. Teachers were kind of delivering shocks to students who were kind of making errors, and they did it in three different stages, right? They were able to, they had to deliver it themselves, and in that case they're like, oh no, this isn't right, I'm not going to do this. Or someone else did it and they were watching the students' discomfort and they're like, oh, maybe that's not a good thing. But then they were behind a door delivering the shock to the students, and then they disassociated. Like, it was like, oh, we can keep going, this, there's nothing wrong with this. And it was like this culture, the researcher played a really key part, because it was like, they're fine, this is part of the research, this is not a problem. And so like the conditioning of, that's okay to do this to these
Power.
students. Yeah, so it was like that cultural acceptance of it, right? And it was, I think, conducted in the larger context of Nazis and the Holocaust. It was like trying to figure out why did this happen? Why was this allowed to happen? So all of that to say, and I know it's a really huge way to kind of compare it to a cultural ecosystem.
No, I get you. Yeah.
Is it the acceptance, right? The acceptance of this behavior. Yeah. But then to kind of go over to this, maybe they don't have capacities. Like, I feel like we're unduly putting this burden on women to lift each other up all the time, right? Or to save the world, or to do all these things outside of your 9 to 5 that we don't necessarily do to men. And Vanessa and I have this conversation a lot, like when in planning the Ser Latino Advisor Summit, like, what, this is a lot of work. We're not getting paid for this. We're trying to do something for the greater good, but why do we feel compelled to do this? Like, I don't, and there's a lot of men in our industry who are doing really good work unpaid also. I won't impugn them, right?
Right.
But let's talk about that. Like that need to, first of all, the need we feel sometimes to like save everybody or lift everybody up. And then also the need that people expect it. They come to expect, you need to lift me up, you need to give back to me. So that, let's talk about that, because that's such an interesting perspective that I didn't even think about. So let's dive in.
Yeah. Yeah, there is this wonderful research study. It was intended for like Latina and Latina supervision within the world of psychology. It's called No hay rosa sin espina, which translated is there's no rose without where every rose has a thorn. There's like a whole song with that. Anyway, I mean, there's truth in that. Is that when we see someone that we feel like has come from something similar that we've come from, or at least has this like unspoken understanding, there's huge assumptions that go into that. And I think that we can have some emotional injuries that come from that because the assumption is so much bigger than maybe what we might receive from them. But I feel again that's happening on both sides of things. We can't assume that just because someone has inevitably at least some shared lived experience that they're going to want to do the same thing with that. And so I think this comes down to leadership style and everybody's ability to choose how they want to do that. I think that some of the hurt maybe within the industry when we're experiencing maybe like the queen bee phenomenon or any of those things, I think comes from unmet expectations that we need to understand, like where did those come from and why are we assuming that that's should be standard of way of executing leadership, because what we know is that not everybody leads from the same place. Not everybody wants to be an inspirational leader. And I don't know if it's fair to judge that, right? I think that that's when we need to sit and consider, like, is this the right space for me? And what can I do as like you and Vanessa, like what can I do to change that? Because I'm not sure that what's available fits me. And I mean, that's a big courageous leap in and of itself, uh, to try to be a steward of change, to go against the grain that exists. Like that's a lot, especially when you're in an unsupportive structure. So I think that there's so many things at play, but part of it is like these assumptions that we all have, when we're like finally this breath of fresh air, someone that looks like me and sounds like me or is same gendered as how I identify, and we put so much into that person, and then when it's not met, then it's like this like frustration, resentment, hurt that comes up that I think may lead to some of this stuff, right? Which I think, again, is all part of like that bigger system pressure.
Yeah. And we also, in the research, we explored a little bit of the notion of forced entrepreneurship, kind of going back to your point, like a lot of women in our industry have come to that crossroads and like, you know what, this big structure isn't for me. I love the industry. I love what I do, but I need to build my own firm, which has a lot of implications on its own about, the money that you're putting in, the time that you're putting in, like the implications for your own retirement, things like that. So it's just such an interesting concept. And I love how you looked at it from a different way. And separately, this goes back to that notion of we expect it from people sometimes, like we expect it. And Kellen, who was my guest last month's ReFrame, Kellen Brown, she's a mentorship expert. She talks a lot about that. She was and it was right before the episode, we were riffing again, like you and I were. And she was talking about like the differences between mentorship and sponsorship and how like some people are just feel entitled. Like they feel entitled to people's time, entitled to, well, you should help me. It's like, there's a Latina on our C-suite. I would never feel entitled to her time. Like, oh, just because you come from a space, you need to help me and you need to, like, that never even crossed my mind. So it's like, it's so interesting. Do you have thoughts on that? Like, do you feel like that's a trend? Like people, like in general, are feeling more entitled to other people's time or expertise or resources or help? Is that a thing, or is that something we were just kind of?
Yeah, I think that we can go into like the nuance of like generational differences, right? Like generational groups. I think all of that is born out of it's kind of like you can't only take the good and not the bad. As things evolve in certain ways, yes, I do think that there is this push to like, no, like not just settle for good enough, and people really want to kind of like pull for that, except that we can't demand that of someone. And so I think where it feels like entitlement is like, but this makes so much sense and it would be so much easier if, which is true, except that I think the piece that is not seen on that, like let's say on the mentee side, is the time and energy that goes into all of that, because this doesn't exist in the system right now. And I get you wanting that, but it's just unrealistic for me to sustain all of that on my shoulders, right? Like if I'm the singular C-suite woman, and obviously I think the pull is to change, to, you know, to really like change the demographic overall. I think that there's a pull for that. Whether or not it's being implemented at the best is a different story, but I feel like I'd be like, oh my gosh, that's so much. Plus then I have to balance my second job, which is like being a partner, being a parent, keeping up with all of those things. And I feel like these are those like background pressures that we need to consider. It's not like I'm not just this one like one dimensional person. Like this is not all that I am. And sometimes I need to be able to set boundaries for myself. I feel like unfortunately in those maybe those entitled expectations, is like no is okay because I'm setting a boundary for me if I don't have the emotional bandwidth to do that. And that doesn't make me bad. I think it's different than like being like aggressive and being like actively trying to sabotage others. And I feel like that's part of maybe what the research missed. It's kind of like, is this an active thing or that people are experiencing, or is it a passive, like they're just not helping me?
Yeah.
Better. I feel like we need to know more of that, because I think those are major differences.
Yeah, and I think it was a little bit of that active. Like I think some of our respondents in the qualitative research, we found that they actively felt like these people are trying to discriminate against me. They're you know, these other women are not. So I think it was a mix of both, but it felt like the qualitative research responses that they were experiencing that more active discrimination from other women. And so that leads me to my next question, which is, you know, if we are experiencing that active discrimination of people, of other women who are, you know, it's not about like, I don't want to help you. It's I want to hurt you kind of way, right?
Right. Those are two different things. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's shift to talk a little bit more about the active discrimination and that type of queen bee, the ones that sting and they don't die. They just keep going and stinging, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. What are some strategies we as women in the industry could implement if we are in that situation, we're facing that type of thing? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that the important piece there is contemplating where we fall into the dynamic, right? Not in like a victim blaming perspective, but like the only people, and I say this to my patients all the time, the only people that we have control over is ourselves. We can want change and we can feel like, well, that's the fair thing though, right? If I can help them see that this is what's fair, then maybe, or this is not okay. Like we can't change anybody's outlook. We can't change anybody's willingness to look at themselves. All we have is ourselves. And so in that, what I say the first thing to do is like really sit with ourselves and understand like, okay, how much of this is okay for me to tolerate? How much of this kind of creates like a poisonous kind of resentment for myself? And I mean, I guess as we were saying earlier, it's kind of like, is this a good fit for me? Is this space a good fit for me? And if it is, if it's not something that I'm willing to give up despite these experiences, then where am I drawing the line in regards to like boundaries and sacrifices that I'm willing to make or that I'm not willing to make, you know? Because the truth of it is like, we could all want like these utopian organizations that unfortunately that are not realistic in some instances. And so we need to sit with like, what parts are, can we adapt? or not. And then of course the other step would be to like be willing to have the conversations, right? If we are feeling, because we also can't assume that someone is fully aware of their behaviors, right? Again, like so many things are happening simultaneously to all of us, and that's part of this is a very psychological perspective, but I'm just like, maybe something is going on in their life and they're taking it out on you, and that's not fair or okay, but maybe someone just needs that brought to their attention, kind of like, hey, I'm curious, I've been feeling this kind of way, and give them a chance to change. And if that's given and then it still doesn't happen, then I feel like it's like that's a whole next level kind of decision making. But I do think that people should be given the chance to, like, that sucks, right? To be judged on something that you don't even know you're being judged on. And I'm not given the chance to create change. So I think that despite it maybe feeling intentional, can we have a conversation? And with that, I'll say caveat, it's not always safe to have those conversations. And I totally understand that. And I'm not suggesting that everybody is open to that. And I think that's a individual case by case circumstance to really sit and analyze those things. And then get the support that you need outside of that space, right? Whether it's like therapy or seeking out mentorship elsewhere, just in kind of like help validating the experience. Like you'd be amazed at just how powerful that is to be seen and heard by someone and be like, yeah, that sucks, and be validated in that experience. I think that in of itself can really revitalize, and then try to make the changes within ourselves of like, how am I going to tolerate this, and when do I need to kind of step away?
Yeah, I think if you're not able to have that crucial conversation or that tough conversation, like maybe that's your answer right there. Like, this isn't the space for me. I should probably bounce,
Yes, exactly. Like, oh God, I feel like someone might bite my head off if I have that conversation, or there's going to be retaliation, which also, by the way, obviously is a whole HR situation, right? If we feel like so unsafe. But I know that that's terrifying as well. Kind of like, oh, am I like going to actually follow through with like a discriminatory claim through HR? In some cases, I think, yeah, if there's like very clear external evidence of this happening, of like retaliatory behavior or anything like that, of course. And in some instances, it's not going to be on that level where you even have like a case, I suppose, externally, but we know internally we're having reactions, right? I mean, that's the difference between like microaggressions versus macroaggressions, right? There's like subtle ways that can be intentional and active, and then there's like very big, obvious ways. I think a lot of what happens in the underneath is those micro kind of like chipping away at like us on a daily basis. That again, in an ideal situation, you can talk to that person, and in a less ideal situation, we need to reconsider where we're working and if that's a good fit for us long term.
Absolutely. And as we start, I wanted to be mindful of time. I know I got off the rails earlier and started asking a bunch of questions that weren't on the list. But so sometimes, there was a TikTok trend a couple of months ago, or maybe it was last year, where it was like, am I the drama? Is it me that's the drama? Do you remember this one? I love this.
I don't know, but I get it.
But what if we're the drama? What if we're the queen bees, and we don't realize it? Like, what are some ways we could kind of either spot that maybe we're the drama, we're the problem, and then work on it when we find out that maybe that's the case?
Yeah. I think that in a similar way, like, I think we need to sit with ourselves honestly, and some of what we do as therapists, so like right in my clinical practice, is more of like, okay, I'm having this reaction to this person that's different than it is to other people. What's up, right? Like, why? What is being activated for me? And am I okay with that or not? Do I have to do something about it? It's just really sitting and being honest with yourself and trying to kind of like source your reaction to particular people, right? It's part of like, in part, is it that person? Is it how they're coming at me? Is it just like some of my own internalized, sexism and or reactions to whatever, or racism, right? Like, it could be a female that doesn't ascribe to the same culture or identifies the same culture as another, or ethnicity as another. And so we need to sit with all of those pieces. Like, what is it about this person or these people that I'm reacting to? Because it doesn't feel like me, or it's not typical because it's not across the board. So I think that being introspective always, right, is beneficial for us to live our fullest, most authentic life. And then kind of sitting and reflecting, like, are people talking to me? Like, let me talk to people in my own life. Like, how am I being perceived? I think that's a great question that we need to ask ourselves always, both in a place of like, is it me? Am I the problem? But also from the other side, kind of like, am I being assertive enough, or am I being or coming off as entitled? And maybe that's the reason that people are reacting to me this way. Like, I think that that's always a beneficial thing for us to say, like, where am I? How am I being perceived? And is that what I want my perception to be? Or like, yeah, spot on. That's what I'm going for. Excellent. And if it's not, then, well, there we are. And now it's in front of our faces. And now we kind of like choose the route we want to go.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And I think as we get older, I don't know if it's a natural thing. Like, I feel like I've gotten more introspective as I've gotten older, and more, I have more desire to look inside and see these things that go wrong in my life. What role do I play in them, right? So I work with the therapist to help me with that. So that's been very helpful. I don't know if I'm a queen bee or not. Sometimes maybe, I don't know. So like, that's the thing is, I'll ask my therapist. I ask for feedback. So I love it. So Patty, as we wind down, I want to get your perspective. You read the research. As we start to design our 2024 survey, what are some things we should be asking or keeping in mind, especially if we want to study this topic a little bit deeper?
Yeah, I think that part of the pieces that are important to consider is, having maybe some pointed questions about like general environment, right? Maybe even just like a study or like a set of questions that's specifically geared to this experience, right? If you haven't had a queen bee experience, like, is it you? Or, additionally, right? Like, what are the systemic pressures? Having a better understanding of the systems that some of these participants that are saying, like, oh, absolutely, I'm having that experience at work. Okay, can you describe the system that you work in, the culture of the place that you work in? Is it standard across the board where you're experiencing this from men and women, or only from, particular women? Because I think that that's a differentiating thing, right? Like, if that's across the board, leadership is like, there's a hazing process in leadership, that's a top-down issue, not an individual issue, right? So I feel like you need to take those things into consideration to create a more holistic understanding of what's going on. Is there things that are perpetuating this outside of an individual characteristic? Really unpacking those things, and I think that could be really beneficial, as well as like a way to kind of gauge expectations. Like, what are your expectations when you have a female leader, or like, direct report? Like, what are your expectations, and is it that they weren't met, or what are the experiences you're having that are influencing this response? I think that that's a really good thing to consider. And also understanding, like, what steps have you taken to try, right, to address this issue, if any? And if you haven't, why? Right? Is it not safe enough because I've seen something that happened that didn't go well, or I tried and then da 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 da, or I haven't tried because I just assumed that it should be an expectation, right?
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great feedback. I've been asking that question, and so gathering all of the thoughts for the whole team. I love to hear it. So Patty, as we close up, is there anything you want to add that I didn't ask that you would like to include?
No, I think I love to see overlap. I love the interest in and like value seen in the application of psychology, right? The study of human behavior. Anytime you work with a human, there is psychology involved, and I think that it's awesome to see that trend working for the betterment of everyone, not just used as a tool, which is something that I've struggled with, right? Like, ooh, how do we use psychology to leverage blah blah blah, right? Like that's not the intention. That's just as like a clarifying thing too. Like that is not why I'm on staff at Expressive Wealth. That's not the goal at all. It's not about leveraging anything. It's just about being able to give a fuller experience and give space for the human condition so that we're not feeling like an isolated dollar sign, in the financial world. But and I think that anytime I see that happening, I think it's awesome to consider all the layers. And so I don't know that I'm answering anything that you didn't ask, but just kind of reflecting maybe more on like an appreciation for the push of integration across fields, because I don't think that they're as separate as they've been considered in the past.
Absolutely. And I think it only betters everybody, right? It betters the client experience. It betters our experience in the industry, understanding these complex issues. So that's a beautiful statement to end on. And Patty, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This is a joy for me, and keep doing the good work.
For sure. And thank you everybody else for tuning into this episode of ReFrame. Tune in next month. I'll be interviewing Carson's new VP of Workforce and Market Expansion, Dr. Lisa Toppin, live from our Excel conference. Have a great rest of your week, everybody.